First of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm really looking forward to your input tonight. Would you like to tell us and tell our viewers a wee bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Ariel Killick. I'm from Australia originally, with Scottish heritage. My great-grandfather's grandfather and his entire village were forced off their land in southwest Mull by the factor of the 8th Duke of Argyll. So they were all Gaelic speakers, and I jointly set up Australia's first Scots Gaelic summer school over 20 years ago, and happily that's still going. I've been back in Scotland for nearly 8 years now, and I'm a multidisciplinary artist, also working in Gaelic arts, storytelling, circus skills, graffiti art, a wide range of different things. And I was also involved in the advocacy work against the deportation of the Australian Brain family in Dingwall that many people have known about. And also, sadly, in the event, ultimately unsuccessful advocacy for a visa for Sheena Halfpenny, the Nova Scotian Gaelic teacher who tried to work in Mull a couple of years ago. And so on foot of that work, I've been an invited speaker to 8 different independence rallies in 3 countries, including The Hague in the Netherlands with the lovely Raymond, and in Berlin a couple of years ago. So yeah, that's me.
Oh, we're looking forward to having you on the show tonight, Ariel. Good to see you. I mean, the one thing that I find very interesting is that you say you're back in Scotland now for 8 years. I think that's lovely.
It's funny. It just feels natural. I've got my there's just a lot in my sort of family story. People can see that at independentstateofhappiness.com about me. But yeah, my, my grandmother's family really kept the name McKechnie. It was only when she married, obviously, that she lost the McKechnie name, and it has kind of carried on in the family, and it feels weird, even though basically all my family here are dead. It does feel like I'm kind of back in Scotland. At least it feels right to say that. Certainly, many people that I've met in the independent scene have just been so incredibly lovely. And I do sort of feel that sort of quasi spiritual, hard to put your finger on it sense of being at home. But at the end of the day, I've been here nearly 8 years now. It's the longest I've ever lived in any city in adulthood. And I love it. Yeah, Glasgow's a bonny wee city.
Yeah, good. I mean, and as I say, I mean, we've known each other for a while, and you enrich Scotland. And as I say, glad to have you on the show tonight.
Thank you.
But without any further ado, we will now go on to our first topic of tonight, and it's a topic we were talking about last week. We had the Polish presidential election, the runoff at the weekend, and Kat is certainly far more knowledgeable than I am in Polish politics. I think, from our point of view, the wrong guy won.
I think that, well, yes. I mean, I can't stay. I mean, Duda, I compared to Trump. He's a populist. He's a nativist. He doesn't believe in human rights for women. He's just got a terrible human rights record. However, remember that Poland forced these elections through amidst the pandemic, thinking that Duda would win re-election in a landslide, and he won by just the thinnest margin against a centrist. And my conversations with my Polish friends and colleagues have been very interesting in trying to take the positive with it. Because what would have happened if Tchaikovsky would have won by a narrow margin? You know, now change is necessary, right? And everybody's kind of going to have to live through these these hard times. And I mean, my heart breaks for my friends that live there. But I can only try and hope that this will activate more of the population. They had a high turnout for voting, but it was 60 something percent. So hopefully this will activate more of the population, and the younger people voted for Tchaikovsky. So it's kind of like everywhere right now that, change is coming.
I mean, one thing that I noticed on Twitter was there were folks saying, okay, now that Duda is back in, we're going to leave the country, we're going to emigrate. Do you think that is something that's going to be a thing for a lot of people, or is it maybe just a few individuals who were maybe given a bit more airtime than they should have had?
I haven't seen anyone say that they're leaving because of it, but I mean, the people that I know that are there are pretty invested in living there. I mean, I have friends that live here that are, there's a lot of Polish people that live in Edinburgh, who are like, well, that kind of makes Brexit and the decision. I know somebody who's moving back to Poland and they're very unhappy about it, you know. But it's kind of, I think they knew, it's almost like 2019. I kind of felt that the SNP would do well in Scotland, but the Tories were going to win pretty clearly. I think that's kind of what we've got in Poland right now.
Yeah, I mean, the parallels was something that I was seeing as well. I mean, I was again thinking back, as you say, 2019, we had Scotland voting one way, and we had the rest of the UK voting another way. And when we woke up on that Friday morning in December 2019, we knew we had Johnson with a huge majority and basically carte blanche to do what he likes for the next 5 years. Gwen, have you been following the Polish situation at all?
No, not particularly. I must admit, no, I haven't. But I'm hearing it's similarities there. I mean, the fact that people were threatening to leave, we had that going on here as well in 2014, as everybody will remember. People were threatening if we well, people were saying it both sides, but the loudest voice for the people who wanted to leave if Scotland got independence, and that was a way to kind of trigger a little bit of a threat, right? In other words, we're not going to support this nation any longer if it makes those decisions, right? But I mean, obviously, it's not entirely the same situation. But and I do think there's going to be a lot of change. I think that it could be, and I might be wrong in this, it could be that, say, the COVID-19 situation may well start to bring the attention of what's going on in the world to younger people, because I think that part of the problem we have is that people who are young aren't really engaged, haven't been engaged in politics enough. And when I was getting my first vote at 18, I was racing up there to get to vote, but then my dad was quite political, so we were probably quite politicised, and we also had Mrs. Thatcher in Britain at the time, so you can imagine why I was racing up to vote. But that's getting round the corner. But what I'm saying is, I think that more people that are young will start to, I hope, start to become more engaged, because they need to know what's going on in the world, and they need to pay more attention to that than what's going on in the social media, or what's going on in soap operas and Love Island and things like that. They need to start, and obviously gaming as well. All that is more important to them, but I'm hoping this maybe will be a shift.
Well, I mean, they do say that in Scotland is probably the most politically engaged younger generation anywhere in the world, partly because of the referendum campaign for 2014. Is that maybe a reason why, because folk are getting more informed, especially younger folk are getting more informed in Scotland, is that maybe a reason why the populism that we're seeing across Europe right now and across the world, I mean, we just say Trump, Johnson, Farage, Viktor Orban, Duda, is that maybe a reason why folk aren't going for that in Scotland quite so much, because they are getting engaged with facts rather than phrases?
I think in Scotland, we absolutely hate people like that. Actually, we just do. It's almost like part of our culture, right? I mean, I don't think Nigel Farage could walk very far across the border before he was getting pelted with tomatoes or whatever it was that we're going to be chucking, right? Ice creams, I believe it happened at one point, but they wouldn't waste ice cream on him here, because obviously. But it's just like there's a whole feeling against that kind of thing here. But maybe I'm just thinking too positively. But I do think that young people are absolutely for independence whenever you speak to anybody. And I think that the ones who weren't old enough to vote back in 2014, we're going to find that those people will be one of our biggest voting sections, And I do think that that's going to be important, especially when they realise that the future they've got is getting smaller and smaller in terms of, well, the job situation is probably not going to be particularly good. The European situation is going to be really, really limiting for them. And I think they're going to find that there's an awful lot more to be given to them if they can be in their own country with their own, well, for example, having their own Scotland is actually a country that has rights to sit at the United Nations and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I think the young folk in Scotland are definitely our future. I think the latest poll that we had, was it last week, was something about 65% of folk under 25 were in favour of independence.
Just on that, I think what you mentioned there, Colin, about how Scotland is actually going in a better direction. I think what's really, really, really revealing in the Scottish Government's handling of the COVID crisis is that their primary slogan was facts, face coverings, avoid crowded places, clean your hands, 2-meter distancing and social isolation. Now, their choice of that just being a handy phrase, was not made in isolation at all from this kind of, we live in a post-fact, post-truth world. And I absolutely do think that they did want to really reinforce that, because we've heard this kind of thing of like a scam-demic, or this kind of COVID, it's all just a scam, and we've seen that actually has really lethal effects in every country led by these post-fact, post-truth populist male basically leaders with their machismo that they think will give them some sort of protection, as it may have done in prehistoric times, but it's really just completely outdated for the modern age, where we've seen most countries led by a female leader handling it vastly better. So I think that's something incredibly powerful that the Scottish Government has chosen to base their primary COVID messaging on facts.
Now, facts, I get what you're saying, Ariel. Is that maybe something that other countries aren't talking about? You mentioned other countries where they talk about post-fact, post-truth. We've seen all the scams. The classic one is, of course, when we had Donald Trump suggesting that we should maybe all inject ourselves with some bleach, and that might help. I mean, as I say, we'll see countries across the world all dealing with COVID in a different way. Now, we've got the young folk. We've got young folk in Scotland appear to be pretty sensible. We've got young folk.
Today, I was in a cafe. I got locked out of my house for 6 hours, and I was in a cafe just off Byres Road in Glasgow, and most of the people, as they were doing their business, were wearing masks. And what I saw, two incredibly young, fit, strapping lads, they would have been about 23, 24, well-built, tight jeans, clean haircuts, the whole lot. Both of them were wearing masks. And I just thought, that's brilliant. Because what we've seen, particularly with Bolsonaro and with Trump, and especially with Boris Johnson, is this kind of not just British exceptionalist or nationalistic exceptionalist attitude, but male exceptionalist attitude that, to capitulate to measures to contain a crisis is somehow a direct attack on their masculinity. And these kinds of links have been made really, really directly, where people saying, it's muzzling you, or you're a bitch if you use a mask, or you make coronavirus, your corona's bitch, or something if you mask up. It kills people. And it's really quite stark, and I do think that we have seen that played out in the most starkest terms possible.
Yeah, I agree. You've actually turned us into our next topic quite nicely, Ariel. So thank you for that. It was a great lead-in. This mask wearing, as Ariel has been saying, I mean, there's folk that they claim they're emasculinized. The excuses that you see, they really are totally out of this world. Now, we in Germany have had this mask duty, this obligatory wearing of masks, since the middle of April. And it was actually in my hometown, it was introduced earlier than in the rest of Bavaria, because we were a hotspot. So it was introduced in Bavaria for the Monday, but we introduced it on the Thursday. And I've got to say, that was in the middle of April, so we're talking about 3 months ago now. And most folk will wear their masks. It is obligatory if you go into a shop. Mr. Gove, it's obligatory if you go into a shop to get a takeaway as well, by the way. It's obligatory if you go into a restaurant, which are now open, when you're moving about. So if you go into the toilet, you've got to put the mask on. If you're even in an open air market and you're at the stall, you have to wear a mask. Now, most folk are complying with it. And I don't have a problem with it. You know, it's not a big deal. And the classic picture that folk are sharing on the internet right now is, would you rather wear a mask for 10 minutes when you go and buy a pint of milk, or would you rather have your throat cut open and have a mask and a tube stuck down your throat when you're on a ventilator if you get the virus? But young folk in Germany, obviously, we've got our ball bags as well, and we've got the folk that are against it. But what I seem to be seeing on social media, and I'm not just from my own bubble, I look at quite a few accounts, is that especially in those countries which are ruled by populist leaders, like England, like the USA, you have this idea amongst these young males that I'm better than the virus. And we shared a link in the group, our chat group before the show. Somebody actually pulled his gun on a restaurant owner in the USA because he was forced to wear a mask. Kat, what do you think? Why is this mask wearing becoming politicised in some circles, while in Scotland most folk appear to be sticking with it?
You know, my family that's back in Wisconsin, I'm very happy to say that my grandparents that live in Florida had gone up to Wisconsin by my mother before the sharp spike. But I do have family that works in healthcare in Milwaukee, so that's pretty close to a big city. But they're being careful. They're wearing masks. They're taking every precaution that we're taking here in Scotland, or that I am in my flat. But the worry was in Florida, they knew it was coming. They knew it was getting so much worse that people in their 80s, even if they're only getting groceries delivered, there's just so much more of it out there. Personal liberty is such a weird thing in America, where people think that their personal rights supersede the rights of others. And it's not everywhere, but they're sure loud, aren't they? You know, that's about all I can say about that, because I feel like Scotland's home, and I try to avoid the news in America for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed, especially when the wearing became mandatory last Friday in Scotland, I saw most folk on Twitter saying that just about everyone was complying with it. And I was really happy with it. I was really proud of it. I mean, I've been one of these ones that have been going for a few weeks before saying, you know, come on, folk, wear your mask, you know, even if it's not mandatory, it is advised. You just are helping other folk. I mean, it is, again, it's not about protecting yourself, it's about protecting other people. And I was involved in a bit of a campaign on Twitter to try and encourage folk to wear masks. When it became mandatory, most folk appear to comply with it, and that's what my experience has been from what I've seen on social media just the last few days. Gwen, I'm going to come to you in a minute on this topic. We've got shout-outs here now. Indie Live Radio, Ellie Just Ellie, Sandra Wallace, Women for Independence Clackmannanshire, Mark O'Gurlach, Nancy McIver, Colin McPherson, I might spell my name wrong, Walter Sutherland, Jamie Selby, Solidarity SSM International Branch Forwarders One, the Scottish Resistance Independence Live, Cat Carey. That was Ian. Ian Leckenby, thanks for joining the shares and helping us with the shout-outs. It is difficult doing the show and keeping up with the comments. So we have a 100% female panel. And again, I am delighted and honoured to be hosting the show tonight with our first ever female panel. And as I've said to many folk in advance, we've got three women here who've got very strong views, very good views, and I am happy to hear what they're going to say. Gwen, face masks. We cut you off a wee bit.
Yeah, no, I hadn't actually thought. I was, but it's a subject which I completely agree with you on, Colin. I do think that we should have been. Well, I think we should be doing it sooner. I was following what was going on in other countries very closely, particularly about face masks and things people were doing that were successful. Because in my opinion, you follow what's working. You don't need to make it up, because we were quite a wee bit behind what was happening in other countries. But I know the Czech Republic had put on this million masks program in one weekend. They got people sewing them and making them, and they managed to keep the numbers, the numbers of contagion down, for quite a long time. I was making masks myself. I was designing them at home and sewing them and giving them out to people. Mainly I was wearing them. But I just didn't go out to the shops much at all for about 4 months, because I just felt as if that it's just yet another person that's out there. It's not necessary. I can get my stuff delivered. But then I started to go out again. And people would stare at me as if I was a real freak wearing a mask, seriously. And the first 5 minutes I was walking along, people staring, and I thought, but honestly, within a few minutes, I didn't even remember I had it on. And secondly, I realised that they don't actually know who I am anyway wearing this. So what does it matter if they're staring? I kind of like that. So I thought I could be completely outrageous. I can do what I like. No one's going to know me. Then I thought, no, actually, this is my local store with me. I've been coming here for about 10 years. They probably know fine who I am. Plus, my car's all stickered up with yes stickers and stuff on it. So you probably know.
I have to say, this not knowing you wearing a mask, okay, if I'm wearing a mask, it's like covering like this. And so folks see enough of me that they recognise me. So, if I go into any shop wearing a mask, they still know exactly who I am. It's like, hi, Colin, how you doing, big man?
but to be honest, right, the fact is that we're not really, I don't think people like to be drawing attention to themselves. I think Scots are quite kind of canny that way. And I do think it's a wee hurdle to get over, as people, saying, well, do you know, I'm just going to do this. And I don't think they were staring at me because they thought I was mad. And no one said anything to me. A couple of people acted as if I had the virus. They jumped out of my way. I thought, well, that's also quite handy. It really matters, like how to get a seat in a bus, wear a mask and cough. That's a horrible thing to say, right? But it's a Scottish humour, of course. But
I have to say,
it's a matter of getting over that kind of that worry, and really, I feel safe now when I go in, because I know that other people are wearing a mask, and we're not going to be spreading it around when we're talking to each other, breathing or stuff like that. Pretty much, it's it's not completely safe, but hello, it's not going to be an obvious thing we're going to catch just walking around the supermarket.
I've never felt in any way contained in my human rights by wearing a mask. I've been doing it now for 3 months. It's been compulsory in Bavaria for 3 months now. I'm used to it. I've got a great load of masks. I've got a collection. I've got my Fitbit team. I've got my ice hockey team. Got a few saltires. I've got everything. And it's like deciding what T-shirt to put on, what mask you put on the day. It's actually quite nice, because you can make a wee statement on top of what you did. I think mask is going to be the new normal. This face covering is going to be the new normal. But again, I'll bring you in here, Ariel. Folk weren't really complying with it in Scotland when it was advised, but when it was made mandatory, all of a sudden everybody complies.
Yeah,
does it need government intervention?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes a big difference. And I think a lot of people, I know there's been so much talk about the border, but it is very difficult to see the reasoning why England is wanting to wait till, I think it's the 24th of July to bring it in. I think that just gives another week and a half for Scots to look on that with horror and really feel increasingly nervous, because as it's been sort of stated, viruses, sure, they don't respect borders, but borders can certainly repel viruses. Now, I come from Australia, a place of 7 states and territories, and that's what a country that has real federalism and real devolutionary power in place. All of the states shut their borders. Victoria's just shut their border again. I think Queensland's just shut their border again because the virus has been resurging. I think in Queensland, they are actually imprisoning people for crossing the border. And you know, that level of threat and of legal sort of implications, that's what that is the power of government that's required to really push public behaviour during a pandemic, during a national crisis, and that's their job, and it works most of the time. But yeah, you can see in Australia a country that has proper devolution, proper federalist system, and you know, there were the jokes about, you know, closing down the borders, the Mexicans from the south, you know, people in Victoria, but people understand, you know, viruses don't necessarily respect borders, but borders can certainly repel viruses. I mean, we can only need to look to New Zealand for how it's worked there.
Right, so I'd like to come in here. I'd actually like to bring up a topic we spoke about last week. We had Dave Llewellyn on the panel, and I'd like to put this to you, Gwen. So what Ariel's just told us about what happens in Australia, why is there such a stushy about the English-Scottish border?
Well, I think it's basically another excuse to try to undermine the Scottish government. I think at any level whatsoever. Now, I think that actually, if there wasn't this stushy that they were creating, and it's coming from all angles, all media angles, right, and political angles, from Westminster, obviously from the basically the UK supporting elected members, that they want to undermine that possibility, because if we do that, it establishes Scotland as an independent country, isn't it? A country which has got decision-making skills for itself. Now, they've tried to make it more and more difficult for Nicola to be able to do that. And you can tell by the questions that they're trying to entrap her into making that point. They're trying to entrap her into speaking about independence. And actually, if I were her, I would probably have said it a bit clearer by now. I would have said, well, Scotland is a country. What she did do, actually, you probably noticed, Ariel, she used Australia as an example of when she might consider doing it. I wanted to shut it, not for people who have to travel up and down for work. They could have stickers on their car that they're given, right? But I don't think people should be freely allowed to enter a country that's managing to contain the virus. In another week's time, we'll be in the situation that New Zealand was in 3 or 4 weeks ago, won't we, if we continue the way we are? But the fact the tourist season's starting, and we know that people are going to come from England, where there's a much higher density of the virus within the populations. So I don't think it's good. I wish she had stopped thinking about that and just made the decisions for Scotland.
The people who are really against closing the border, they fundamentally, you know, who are bringing a political issue into it and blowing the political aspect of it up, they fundamentally care more about the health of the union than the health of the people.
Yes, here.
And that's what it comes down to, because if you cared more about the health of the people, you would see that this is a basic public health issue that protects all the people in Scotland, protects the capacity to open up the economy again, protects the capacity to open up schools without social distancing again, protects the capacity of our children to receive a full education, protects the capacity of childcare workers to go back into work, to help women return to work, to return to a more normal life than, as you know, they've been suffering something like 47% of job losses and suffering major burnout because they've been taking on childcare, education and their own jobs during lockdown. And that's the issue. People who are really blowing up the political aspect of closing the border from an anti-independence angle, they fundamentally care more about the union than they care about either people or public health.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Here, Ariel, I mean, the health of the union is more important than the health of the people. I think that is a point. I think that is something that we will have to be getting out in social media sharing, because that is exactly what it is. Fiona McGregor comes in the chat. Don't know why we are talking about closing our border. If Westminster had any notion of an equal union, they would be shutting the English border until they get their infection levels under control. Failure to do so is a political decision, not a public health one.
What I will say
again, just a minute, Ariel, please. What we've seen in New Zealand is New Zealand had the virus. They were effectively COVID-free. They opened their borders again to tourists, And all of a sudden, they had a cluster because they had folk coming in, tourists. I don't. I'm sorry. I think the couple that
They were UK.
went tourists, I think they were going for a family funeral.
Yeah.
So I mean, not tourists, but again, they created a cluster in New Zealand. So Australia can do it, New Zealand can do it, Germany can do it. The outbreak in the meat production factory, several German states said we won't take visitors in our hotels from that part of the country. So why is it such an issue between the Scottish and English border, which, according to Boris Johnson, doesn't even exist?
What I will say on this, however, even though this is such a big point, unionists fundamentally care more about the health of the union than the health of the people. There's a very, very good reason why Nicola is highly averse to closing the border, because Westminster, as we know, is currently run by a bunch of dangerous shysters, duplicitous in every way, and they are just as likely to retaliate by cutting off funds to Scotland, or using that action to legitimize God knows what kind of contemptuous, seriously dangerous behavior as a backlash to Scotland. And I think that is the biggest reason for the Scottish government to really step back from taking that action. And in that way, they're protecting the Scottish people through that. But that's just a really, really sad reality of where Scotland stands in this place within the Union. And it cannot take an action to protect itself, because it would only double the damage on itself that this dangerous crowd, run essentially by an unelected bureaucrat, Cummings, is inflicting on Scotland. We can see different aspects of federalism or, this kind of state borders in the EU. That's a union. Everybody closed their borders. They were fine with that because they recognize public health is more important than that kind of unionist approach.
Yeah, I can remember way back in March, at work, I deal with folk in Saarland, which is right next to the French border. And they were saying...
That's where my family's from.
They say France was in lockdown. And basically, France was in lockdown. They couldn't cross the German border. This is within the Schengen Agreement, noticeably. So basically free movement, but the borders were closed down within the Schengen area. And this guy was saying to me, he says, you wouldn't believe it. He says, the folk, they're coming over the fields, they're coming over through the woods just to get over the border because they're not allowed to go over the official border posts. I mean, you're always going to get ballbags. But the border can be closed, and I think the way that, as a whole within the EU, the virus has been contained, it shows that also closing borders is part of containing the virus. The same as you'll have a local lockdown in Leicester, for example. We had a local lockdown in Dumfries and Galloway. You contain the virus because you put localised measures in. Now, localised measures can be on the small scale within individual towns, but it can also be on the bigger scale, the border between Scotland and England. And that is not anti-English. That is protecting the people. Kat, before we go on to our final point for the evening, do you want to say anything else about the border? Because I know in the US, states also have border controls.
Yeah, there are. And there are also like internal power struggles over the states, over whether the governor or the state legislature. It's a mess. But I want to say something about in Scotland. I don't think that what I've heard, and I missed the Scott Gov brief today, is that if it becomes necessary, that these measures will be taken. Because at first we didn't have mask enforcement because hardly anyone was going out. And then as more and more people were going out and more people were in the shops, then they enforced masks. And, I live close to the Meadows in Edinburgh, so it's always crowded. There's been a couple punch-ups. We can see there'll be police officers patrolling it. So maybe part of this is like really boring logistical things of, okay, what are the numbers? Do we need this for public safety or not? Because I don't think that Nicola Sturgeon would hesitate to take those actions if she felt it was necessary to protect the people. So sometimes I think that this is kind of the word border was brought up by a Scottish Tory to Boris Johnson, and who said, I mean, talk about throwing a meatball pitch, to try and get a home run to get Scottish people angry about borders. And I just think that, what Leicester closed down part in America, in the EU, I don't think that they won't do that if it becomes the case. And also, like, test and protect is also different in Scotland than England. That's been a huge difference. Is we didn't try and use an app. They did a whole different system in place, which was much more conservative and safe. And I think it shows the trust in the Scottish government that everyone's following. Obviously, mistakes are made and nobody's perfect, but I do think that, like, some of the parents at my kids' school were upset because schools weren't opening close. And I said, just wait. And here now schools are opening again full time in August. So I think hopefully we won't have to wait for, a health outbreak. Hopefully we can contain it. I think that is not something that I have not heard the Scottish government rule out patrolling the border. I just think they've said it's not necessary yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that might well be a lot is down to the point that Ariel is making, that it will be politicized. Did any of you folk watch the debate at Westminster, the opposition debate yesterday?
I have to say, despite being an invited speaker at 8 independence rallies, preparing speeches, doing all the research, preparing speeches with my big head puppets as well at about 3 additional rallies. I've been fully immersed in all of the various arguments. I don't know how many SNP branch meetings we've had via Zoom during lockdown. I've really reached a bit of a barrier. I mean, I remember listening to one, and I think the reason why I haven't listened to any of the Westminster debates is I distinctly remember I think listening to one of the debates, Scottish questions or Prime Minister's questions, either shortly before or after the election, and I was nearly in tears. It was so contemptuous. It was utter contemptuous bullying of Scotland. And it's, you know what, before the 2014 referendum, I think Sir Harry Burns, who I think was the former Chief Medical Officer for the Scottish Government, he actually stated publicly that he thought that independence would have a positive health impact for people in Scotland because they would feel like they had more control over their lives, that they felt control was closer to them. Now, at some point in the latter half, I think, of last year, research had found that there'd been something like a 15% rise in suicides in Scotland. And it's very difficult to see that there is no link between this constant contempt for Scotland publicly, this kind of boorish yelling and bullying and cheering against Scotland, whilst they, ostensibly claim to, love Scotland and the Union, and not see how people feel disenfranchised when we've had basically democracy denied to Scotland repeatedly, when repeated mandates are denied. We don't have democracy, basically. And if Scotland doesn't have democracy in this union, it shouldn't be in this union.
I'll tell you what, Ariel, you preempted my question, but you effectively answered my question as well without having watched the Westminster debate, because I was actually going to go on a wee bit of a limb and not the final topic we'd talked about, but about yesterday's Westminster debate, because there was a Westminster debate. Effectively, it was the SNP Opposition Day debate, and it was looking for an extension of the transition period because of COVID and all the negotiations that the UK government is having with the European Union. They are hindered because folk have other things in their minds. Now, I started off with a very good speech for Ian Blackfoot, who was also making the point that Scotland is being ignored, with the usual heckling from your Tory MPs, not quite so much as usual because social distancing, there's not so many in the chamber. Labour.
They sure tried their best, though, didn't they?
They did their best. Labour couldn't be bothered to turn up. They had the front bencher. The one MP in Scotland, he must have been at the dry cleaners getting his Union Jack suit getting dry cleaned because he was busy. He couldn't be there. We had Christine Jardine from the Lib Dems saying the SNP don't speak for Scotland despite having 48 out of 59 seats. And because Labour, the official opposition, couldn't be bothered turning up, what we had in the last hour was Tory after Tory after Tory standing up, doing his wee spiel, and every single one of them, obviously representing English constituencies. Now, I have no problem with that. The Westminster Parliament is a UK Parliament, and English MPs should have just as much a right to debate as Scottish MPs should, which they deny us under evil in certain scenarios, but leave that one to one side. The English Tory MPs were standing up one after the other, egging themselves on, braying like donkeys, saying how useless Scotland is. Pete Wishart was winding up for the SNP on the Opposition Day debate, and he did an absolute brilliant speech. I have one wee qualm. I don't like what he said about the border protest, but apart from that, it was a brilliant speech. And he was saying, see, folk in Scotland are watching. All of you talking us down, your contempt. People in Scotland are watching. You are making the case for independence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're nodding. I know you watched at least some of it, I think. Is Pete Wishart right? Are the Tories in Westminster making the case for Scottish independence? Are folk in Scotland seeing that? Or are they switching off like Ariel is?
Well, I don't typically watch Prime Minister's questions because I study EU politics. I'm American. I watch First Minister's questions. I found that it's useless a little bit. It's almost like I'm hurting my own mental health. But I watched the clip of Pete Wishart, and I was like, yeah. And I think I even tweeted out, like, I agree 100% with Pete Wishart, and I hardly ever agree 100% with any politician, to tell you the truth. But that statement he made, and I understand what you're saying about the border. I think that the SNP have to, I think that is what the line that they have to toe, is that we will guard the border when we need to. And I think that was, a political necessity. But everything else he said, I mean, before Boris Johnson was the prime minister, that's what everybody was saying. Like, he's going to get independence for Scotland. It's not fun to watch. I don't want people in England to hurt. A lot of people, I have friends in England that are like, can we move up there? And I said, yes, I think so. Come on up. Because I get a little bit touchy when people say, well, can't Nicola come down here? And I'm like, no, you can't have what's like, no. I don't think she's interested. But I have a friend in New Zealand that said people keep saying about Jacinda Ardern, and they're like, she's ours, get your own. And there's people. I think that a lot of people in England are seeing Scottish independence. A lot of people in Wales are seeing independence. They're seeing it as a way out for everyone that's in the UK, because the British government, are they representing any of the people? Honestly?
I think what's important is not so much the fact that some of the countries that have crushed the COVID curve so successfully have been led by women, but a really salient point was that they have the kinds of society where a woman can rise to the highest level of power. And that affects all aspects of society in different ways. When we look at a country like America, where there was such vicious, overwhelming misogyny, and out of that, sausage machine, we got Trump. And out of, the social sausage machine of New Zealand, they got a female prime minister who actually gave birth in office. And I think that is a reason for hope for Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, just a few comments in. There's a couple of comments back on a previous topic that, so I'm just lost it again. Pat Lee, if restrictions not in place soon, the good work to reduce the R numbers under threat. Tommy Gooley, I'm in Govan. We already have loads of camper vans here. And Sheila Brown, we've had tourists arriving up in the Oban area all through the lockdown. Again, I think you're picking up on the point that I made. What was Lamont's contribution? I mean, this ties into the border issue, but ties into yesterday's debate. It was John Lamont, the MP for, what is it, Selkirk, Roxburghshire, and I can't remember the exact name of the constituency. Tory boy, basically, who accused the entire nationalist movement in Scotland of being racist on the basis of the one Ewan troll who put the remark out on Twitter about the border protest the other week. John Lamont, an MP for the Borders, his only remarks were accusing all nationalists, and by definition, therefore, every SNP member that was sitting in the House at the time, of being racist. That is what Pete Wishart came up against. Again, and Pat also made the point, apart from the border protests, that's what I said before, Pete Wishart's speech was absolutely brilliant. I didn't quite like what he said about the border protests. I would have liked to have seen a different angle taken, because that border protest was not racist. It was not anti-English. We discussed it last week on the show with Dave Llewellyn, who was at the border on that day, and with Pat Lee, who was on the way to the border until private circumstances meant he couldn't go there. My question to you, Gwen, is this all the English Tories, or even the Scottish Tories, have left to accuse us of being racist? Is this them scraping the bottom of the barrel because they know they've got no arguments left?
Well, basically, it is smoke and mirrors, isn't it? If you keep blowing smoke at us and telling us we're racist, we'll be scared to stand up for ourselves. Now, that's the same as being afraid to use your own colloquial dialect, or you'll not get a job if you speak with your own accent. You need to sound more English. Through your entire life, you've been made to believe that we're somehow exactly what people were saying earlier about how you feel as if you're second class and not important, right? Well, why would we feel like that if we were being treated properly, right? First of all, and secondly, of course, it's smoke and mirrors to make us not be upset, to make us look like horrible people in the world. But can I just mention one thing? Yesterday in Wales, they actually just debated independence in their parliament for the very first time. Does that make them racists as well? So the Welsh racists. What about in Ireland when they want? And I'll have to say Northern Ireland, I suppose. I prefer not to have to use that term, but they're actually are they racists as well? No, we're not, because actually there's hundreds of people who live in England who are Scottish, and vice versa. In fact, there's a lot of English people who are involved in our campaigns. I'm just saying this clearly to the people who maybe haven't watched the show before or don't necessarily know about Scottish independence. We're very often accused of being racist if we dare to speak up for Scotland's rights as a nation and as a parliament. And the fact that we're doing well, they make comments like, yes, they're just doing it deliberately to make the English look bad. So even if you do something really well, you're still accused as always twisted. You're doing that deliberately. So.
I mean, I'm actually technically half English. My mother's family left Northern England, a small town near Bury in Manchester in 1953 in the sort of post-war slump era as £10 poms, £10 for, I think it was a 6-week or so journey on a ship out to Australia. I've never lived in England, but I am technically English. I've been to the town. I've seen the wee house that my mother grew up in. But I also grew up in Australia, which has obviously a huge history of colonial, imperialist, genocidal colonialism. And I am offended more so as a human being, as a Democrat, as a modern citizen of a modern world, to see this, a kind of anti-democratic practices, this duplicitousness that's going on. And I can certainly understand with people south of the border in England who really are wishing Scotland the best with independence, because they can see what's happening around the world. We've basically seen democracy shut down for Hong Kong. Their independence movement really killed off by the Chinese government. We see that President Xi and President Putin have basically given themselves lifelong terms. Putin just recently ran a sham referendum. He'll be in power till he's 83. I think it was either last year or previously. President Xi of China changed arrangements so he'd be in power for life. We know that President Trump has made positive soundings on that front. We've seen, effectively concentration camps for Uyghurs in China, effectively caging children in effectively concentration camps for migrant children in the US, Duterte, where thousands of people have been shot dead in extrajudicial murder in his drugs campaign, basically murder under another name, Bolsonaro, and, these populist approaches to COVID that have left people dead. We've seen Modi basically removing citizenship from Muslims in India, one of the biggest so-called democracies in the world, effectively building more concentration camps for Muslims. It's really, really worrying. And I have to say, going back to what we started with at the beginning with Poland, watching interviews with gay people and gay activists in Poland just over the last couple of days, what really, really struck me was how they spoke about President Duda and his campaign, basically dehumanizing them. And what people certainly outside of Poland really recognize from Poland is, hang on a sec, weren't there like Jewish ghettos and Auschwitz? And what happened last time? A whole section of people were dehumanized in these kind of approaches. It's a very, very scary time. And I think it's so important that we really do stand up much, much more forcefully, peacefully, but forcefully for democracy in Scotland. That it is not acceptable that Westminster just keeps denying repeated mandates for independence from Scotland, because if Westminster denies Scotland democracy, if we don't have democracy in this union, we should not be in this union.
Well, I think all of us in this panel would agree, and probably most of our viewers would agree, that we shouldn't be in this so-called union any longer. Every day is too much. Unfortunately, our time is running out. We had another topic we were going to speak about, but it doesn't matter. It'll be just as relevant next week. I want to bring a couple of comments in from the Facebook chat, especially Leanne Warren. I'm English and totally agree with Kat. I want Scotland to get independence. I want Wales to get independence. I don't want this government to drag you all down into our isolationist, populist ways. Fingers crossed, I can hopefully escape from this corrupt, rich country and come and live in Scotland. Leanne, thank you. I think you might live in England. Fair enough. You will be welcome in Scotland, because Scotland is a welcoming country. And another very important point from Ian McNeil. Hi guys, I organised the border protest. I'm disgusted with all that branded us racist. Ian, I am absolutely with you on that. We had a big discussion with Dave last week, and we all agreed that it was disgusting, and that is the one thing that disappointed me, and I will put it on the record here. In Pete Wishart's speech, when John Lamont came out with his pish, that Pete Wishart effectively took that racist point. I distance myself from that, because you weren't racist at the border. You have that on record from me. I think overall, though, the whole speech from Pete Wishart was good. We need to get more folk in Scotland, no matter how much it might hurt, watching Westminster live. We have to get them watching the House of Commons, because you see the way that the Tory MPs, be they Scottish Tory MPs or English Tory MPs, slag Scotland down. You think Jackson Carlaw as a bawbag. Watch the English Tories at Westminster. They're 10 times as bad. It really is something you have got to watch. So if you've got time of an afternoon and there's a debate which in some way reflects on Scotland, please watch it on Parliament Live. And as Pete Wishart says, if you're maybe unsure about the need for independence, you will be persuaded.
I think that's
Ellie,
a point where I can actually disagree with you.
Can you just give 1 quick minute, please? I'll come to you in a minute. Ellie, I was born and raised in England, moved up to Scotland in 2010. I think of myself as being Scottish now. Wouldn't go south of the border even if you paid me. Kevin Campervan man, the Tories will ignore the polls. Carnot Duel's watching. Martin McCann, my partner, is Polish and was so gutted by the recent election there. Tommy Gooley, your unimitable style. Non-elected numpty Cummings is running the UK government. Sheila Brown, I was accused of being an anti-English racist bigot last night. Oh, that's big style. For replying to a post about Nicola putting India on the back burner by saying, let's get on with sorting out the pandemic and let the other SNP MPs got on with organising a referendum. And Tyler Carey, I think maybe somebody in the Parliament might know him. The problem is with the Westminster government and what they perpetuate, not the English as a people. It's cheap, deflecting rhetoric that somehow attempts to make the desire for independence about racism. Folk on the chat, thank you all for your comments tonight. We appreciate them. Again, we are coming up to the end of the show, and the show about the power grab, the topic of the power grab, we will hold that over till next week. I would like to put it over to our panel now for some final comments, last words, or whatever. Kat, you've been quiet for a while. Come on in.
I write it on your calendar, right? I had a couple things written down, and I didn't prompt that comment, so from Tyler. But when you were talking about the Tories in Westminster, I would say I disagree that I don't watch that, and I might read about it later, but I'm trying to act independently. I'm trying to act like we're independent. So since the Tories have such a majority, for me personally, fueling that anger in my belly is not productive. I've already got the anger and now I need to channel it. So, but I do think that reading the transcripts and looking at it instead of reading it through the lens of a news show, other than this one, of course, is really, really important. I spend a lot of time watching press briefings and reading the transcripts from them because I don't like to hear another person's take on it until I have mine, because you read a lot between the lines and we don't control the media narrative here. So a lot of this just it's like they're poking us with sticks, just trying to see what they can come up with, like the Labour leadership contest when they dangle the "Are you gonna say you hate Scotland?" thing for all the candidates. Just keep the heat. That's what I say every day, right? Or every week.
If there's not an obvious sign of Scotland being treated with disdain, then this is the moment to keep your eye very closely to what's going to be happening in the next week or so. Because if Scotland's already decided how it would spend the money that was coming from the EU to help us to prosper, this is a moment where everybody in Scotland should be paying absolute 100% attention.
Well, in honour of tonight's inaugural first all-female panel, I think it's really instructive to think of our suffragette forebears, because it is just 111 years since the first suffragette went on hunger strike for democratic representation for women, and they went on to win democratic representation for half the planet. I do think that we need to learn from their lessons, because Westminster isn't listening. With this white paper and debate in Westminster yesterday, they're not just going further down this road where they have ignored and denied democracy and repeated democratic mandates for Scotland. They are looking to overturn devolution itself and ignore further democratic mandates for Scotland for further self-governing powers.
Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, everybody who has joined in the show tonight. Thank you all that we've been watching. Thank you all the comments on Facebook and on other platforms. What remains for me to say is obviously also thank you to our panel.